All right, folks, we are back from our brief summer hiatus so that I could go to the beach and Sean could recover from the draft. And now we're back to talk to you about the most important hockey development that's happened in the last 2 weeks, the launch of Puckdoku. Sean, what's your strategy here?
So I go with it didn't start that way, but I kind of being a bit of a goalie nerd, and we've talked about that a little bit on this show. I go with I end up trying to find goalies that played for both teams. The other day I went 8 for 9 with goalies. It was the one with the Vesna winner there, but I just could not think of, and I looked one up later, and there was one I would have never ever gotten, but there's only like finding a goalie who had played for both Boston and Nashville was just practically impossible. So I go with that. I also have obviously a bit of the personal bias from teams from people I've covered, where I randomly will flip people in on that. Like for example, Mike McKenna is a great one on this. He played for so many one gamers for so many different teams. Or like today's, right? Like Ryan's going to have this out before the end. Ryan won't have this out before the end of the day. So if I'm ruining anyone's strategy today, I'm sorry. But like I had today for my Detroit Tampa one, I went with Jamel Smith. Like that was a good like 1%er where I had, obviously that one popped for me because I covered Jamel Smith in Dallas. He was here recently or last year for 2 or 3 games or whatever, 2 seasons ago. And, so I go with, I lean goalies and people I covered, and then after that I start trying to remember guys I watched when I was a kid. That's kind of the hierarchy. What about you?
I leave it to the expected by whom folks to apply analytics to Puckdoku here to figure out kind of the best strategy. But honestly speaking, the oops all goalie strategy is very good, if and only for so many high-level goalies played for so many different teams. It's kind of mind-boggling when you sit back and think about it. I mean, you look at like a guy like Curtis Joseph. He's a great answer for this because a lot of people remember watching Curtis Joseph. He wins 450 games in the NHL, but he played for St. Louis, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, Detroit, Phoenix. Grant Fuhr's another one where he plays for 6 different teams. I mean, even Hasek gets you 4 different teams. And so the goalies are so recycled, but so many of the high level ones are that they're easy to remember for me. And that's kind of where I tend to start. But what I've noticed as I've been playing this is my brain is either locked into late 1990s, early 2000s players, or like players from the last 5 years. Somehow I've entirely blocked out 2005 to 2015. I have no idea why that's the case, but I cannot for the life of me come up with players, that played on those teams. Like I was trying to today, and again, we're not spoiling anything. I was trying to come up with a 50 plus assist man for Buffalo, and I could not think of Jason Pominville. That was who I wanted to think of. And I was like, there's Thomas Vanek, there's Chris Drury, there's Danny Briere. Who am I missing on that like late 2009 Sabres team that would have been it? And I could not come up with Jason Pominville because I completely forgot all of those guys. So, it's kind of weird how your brain works here, but it's been a fun game to apply my random useless hockey knowledge to.
Yeah, with mine for the Sabres one, you talk about early 90s, like I ended up going with Phil Housley, right? Where it's like, that's another way pullback 90s one. The goalie ones too, like for example, there's so many guys who will be in your mind, right? They'll have been with one team for forever, and then they'll have the 3 or 4 year stint where they tried to keep it going, or they moved on. Like the one that pops for me the other day, that like you forget of all the teams you can get, but like Jose Theodore, right? Where it's like you think of Jose Theodore, Montreal Canadian, you think of he won an MVP there and everything like that. You kind of some people probably remember he played for Colorado because that was like 3 years and it was an in-season trade, but his time in Washington, you seemingly forget. He had a weird stint in Minnesota, I think, and then I think I think he was actually maybe even the starter in Florida for a little bit. Him and like staying in that same division, like you always think about Tim Thomas in Boston in Florida pads, or Tim Thomas wearing the Florida pads while playing for Dallas, which was one of the weirdest like sets you've ever seen. It's the goalies are kind of, I thought it was initial bias, but then it became good strategy, right? And then it's a fun way to get the brain going, but I've been able to kind of tap into at least a little bit more, I think, of the 2005 to 15, I guess. But it's still I still also do have a bit of that deferment to, I go to late 90s, who I watched right away when I was a kid growing up, to more recently. I think that is a fair, like recency plus recency bias and nostalgia both colliding before you get to the mid history, I guess.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. I don't know. I can't explain how my brain works with all of that, but it's like guys that are coming to mind as I have the Red Wings, on the board for today, and we're recording this on Wednesday, July 12th. So the Red Wings were one of the teams that you could select, and it's like, all right, I'm running through. All right, Tim Taylor, Brent Gilchrist, like running through that era of Mark Mowers, these random, Red Wings forwards that played on the fourth line and kind of filled in over the years. And it's like, those are the guys that are coming to my mind, and not, more recent hockey players that you could have much more easily accomplished this. But, that's the whole goal of it, is to get your brain working, to challenge what you're thinking. And that's the goal of our podcast here. And so, folks, welcome back to another episode of Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans out there, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Just recently hit number 2 on Chartable, so make sure you tune in. And so find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. So I obviously opened the show by saying that the biggest news of the last 2 weeks was the launch of Puckdoku. That's very clearly not the case. Obviously, we've had the NHL Draft, which, Sean, you got to attend and actually interview Matt Rodell of the Dallas Stars there. And then we've had the start of NHL free agency. And so I figured in our first episode back from this brief hiatus, we should probably do a quick league-wide recap, first of the NHL Draft, maybe talk about some winners and losers there, and then we can kind of hit the highlights of the early part of free agency. And so let's start with the draft. And, from your time there, what did you get the vibes, what were the vibes like in terms of who you thought maybe came out as a winner from the NHL Draft?
Kyle from Chicago was clearly the winner of the draft. Kyle Davidson, the GM of the Blackhawks, who I'm sure everyone has seen the video by now, but if you haven't, just Google Kyle from Chicago and you will find it. That's the winner of the draft right there. Didn't matter what he did on the stage, that's the draft winner, Kyle from Chicago.
Easily the best draft content I think I've ever come across. That video, for, again, as Sean mentioned, if you haven't seen it, go and look it up. Somebody was literally interviewing Kyle Davidson, general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks, without knowing they were talking to Kyle Davidson, general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks. Absolutely hilarious content.
It's there's two parts of it I want to know, because I actually know one back end part. So Ben, I know from my time in Dallas, one of the former Stars PR guys is now one of the PR guys with Chicago. And I was talking to him at draft day after that video had came out. And he was telling me the back end story of Kyle did the interview with the person on the street. And then he called the PR guy being like, hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. I just did an interview, but it's not going to be anything you expected. So I have an insight to what the back end was for what the Blackhawks when this was coming out. But the one I want to know is, I want to know, clearly, obviously the interviewer doesn't know who they're talking to. I want it to be the fly on the wall when the person producing and editing the video, the Ryan Hanna of that production, realized what they had. That's what I want to be, where the person sitting back in the office going through and editing the video and putting it together realizes, like, wait, do you realize who this guy is. Like, that's the background story I really want. That would be like, it's the equivalent of us like interviewing someone on the show and having no idea, and then Ryan calling us like, you just talked to Steve Yzerman. Like that's like, I want to know how that conversation went on the back end. Who saw Kyle Davidson? It was like, oh, that's, who you're talking to, right?
Like, I just want to be there and then be able to immediately play the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme song, like right on top of it, because that's got to be cued in for someone to like have over top of that, because that was just an all-time hockey moment. And so that's very clearly the winner. But as far as the NHL teams, did you get a sense from the draft floor or from, who you talked to of potential winners, even though it's very early? We're talking about just, who guys who've been selected 18 years old right now.
Yeah, Buffalo with why am I drawing a complete blank on his name right now?
Zach Benson.
Zach, getting Benson at 13 was considered a pretty big win. That's one of those now 10 years from now, we'll probably have that discussion about Benson versus Danielson. That'll probably be a Detroit-based discussion 10 years from now when you start looking at that. So, Benson going to Buffalo is pretty big for talking to the prospectors, the people who spend all year doing this and everything like that. And then really, I think the other big winner, obviously, besides we knew Chicago was going to be, you get Connor Bedard, you're the big winner. The other big one, I think, was you can't not be. Now, there's obviously Philly's in the news for some other negative reasons that with their PR staff the past 2 days, but the way Philly was able to land Michkov at number 7, got popped potentially the second best player in the draft at 7, and the way we learned about kind of how they got him into Voorhees, New Jersey, in their practice facility for a private meeting, and they did this. Like, I think it is for a Flyers team that has to rebuild, that has to take some risks on this, has to do that. I think it's hard not to look at Philly as it's hard not to look at Philly as one of the winners of the draft. And I think that's to me that was a big one. And then the other one that was just, and this isn't a general team, but it was just a general theme of it. And I don't call this a winner or a loser. You call it. It's the fact of no trades on day one. I think that's always going to be one of these storylines. There was no movement at the draft itself on day one. Obviously, there was in day 2 and everything like that. But I think that's going to be kind of one of the storylines that obviously will later connect to one of our conversations later, because obviously we all thought Alex DeBrincat was going to be moved at draft day and moving a week, 10 days later or whatever. I think that's the other big thing. But like Kyle from Chicago, Philly getting getting a player like that, Buffalo getting a player that probably shouldn't have dropped out of the top 10. And then the other one, and just the big story, I think, if you talk about big swings and the team that probably has the most to gain from this draft, just long term, if Toronto was right on Ewan, if they're right on him, if he becomes a superstar and they swung big, we will forever have that clip of the kid who literally is not on the right side of like how the draft is set up, right? Like there's everyone who was in top 40 by NHL Central Scouting was on the left side so they could walk down and go onto the stage. He's on the right side of the building because NHL Central Scouting and the NHL people didn't even think he'd go in the top 45 or whatever. So we'll have that clip. If Toronto's right on him, if in their first draft under this regime, they swung big, they got the kid no one thought was going to go top in the first round, they'll have that clip forever of like the awkward, he didn't even get to walk across the stage because he had to walk through the sides and everything like that. So if Toronto was right 5 years from now, 7 years from now, we'll be like, you know what? Well done. But for now, it was just kind of comical. But so that's those are kind of, I would look at the winners for me, and then And then the other thing I would just key in on draft stuff is I now try to be very careful on, because we watch these, there's the Scott Wheelers of the world, there's the Cam Robinsons of the world, there's the people who watch these guys all year long, who I'm going to defer to them on who got it right versus wrong, as opposed to me pulling up the YouTube clips for 5 minutes or seeing a guy, or like I see a couple guys with, like, I go watch NTTP play a little bit and everything like that, but I don't know when I'll ever get to watch I guess maybe I'll see a WHL team come to Saginaw for the Memorial Cup next year. But other than that, I don't know when I'm going to go see a WHL team play in person. So now I just try to be kind of careful on not overstepping and pretending I'm an expert on some of these kids when I'm not.
Yeah, I think the last 2 points that you raised, one about the Leafs drafting Easton Cohen, and then the second point about just not having the time to see everybody, those are critically important points, because when we talk about winners and losers at the time of the NHL draft, what we're really talking about is people that were selected before or after public lists had them listed or ranked. We are not going off of team knowledge, and we've seen over the years that the team lists are dramatically different than what public perception is, and even what some of the most acclaimed public scouts have. The team lists are very different, and you'll find a team will come out and tell you that they got everybody on their list, or they got the best guys that they wanted at each position, because their lists are extraordinarily different. And so you're absolutely right. We have to be very careful when we're talking about winners and losers of a draft at the time of the draft, simply because we're really just evaluating against what public lists have them. We don't have any other information to go on. Nobody's publishing each individual team's rank list and then saying, oh, you could have gotten this player maybe a little bit later. So that's very hard to judge. But I think you definitely have to give a lot of credit for the Blackhawks getting Bedard and Oliver Moore at 19. He was a favorite of mine. I think that gives him some legitimate potential. Michkov going to Philly, like you mentioned. And I think the other team that I'll sort of highlight, I thought did pretty well, is Detroit. And I know a lot of people are going to question the Nate Danielson pick and, kind of wonder why he was taken at 9 when you had, Oliver Moore go later at 19. You had, Zach Benson, arguably one of the most dynamic forwards, go, a few picks later to Buffalo. But I think the Wings fit two needs. And for them, that's what they, are looking to do. And so anytime you have an opportunity to plug in players that fit into your roster, I think that's what that's all you can really do to consider it a success. And so I think you have to give a lot of credit there.
And the other thing too, just for a pretty recent example to talk about, guys falling and guys and people, like how many people. I mean, the 2018 class for Detroit, obviously the big news this past couple of weeks of Zadina basically mutually getting contract terminated with Detroit. And you remember at that draft when Veleno goes all the way to, it was 30, right? I think. And when Veleno goes all the way to 30 and people are like, oh man, this is a steal at number 30. And not that Joe Veleno hasn't been a serviceable NHL player, but it's not like you're looking at this guy and watched him play in the league. We're like, oh man, they got this future top 6 driving guy who's going to be the face of the franchise at number. Like, I think that's a good present day example of how much the sliding scale can change of things. And we've talked about it before, and I know you've done a lot with building the app this year of tracking of draft stock for guys and everything like that. It really is fascinating to see the tiers of where the players are, of what we expect them to be, of like, okay, there's the Bedard tier, and then is there the Smith, Moore, Michkov tier. It's like, it will be fascinating to look at this draft 3 to 4 years, 3 years now, 5 years, 7 years of, okay, how did those tiers shake out? It's going to be interesting. I do think one thing that I will be interesting to me is I'm curious of and I think I may have brought this point up before when I was making our conversation of just you and I were talking about only taking goalies after the 5th round. I do wonder if we're getting farther and farther away from like Mark Stone. I wonder if Mark Stone will be like the last captain to not draft. I wonder if Mark Stone will be the last captain not drafted in the first 3 rounds to lift the Stanley Cup. Like, I really wonder that. Like, and maybe there's someone who's a captain right now who's drafted later that I'm missing. I don't know. But I think the league is so well drafted now where I think we're getting farther and farther away from late finds actually being anything. And I think for that reason, we're seeing more and more of those, like, kind of off the board picks in general, where we see like, hey, maybe we take the kid from the German league. Maybe we take the kid who played, I think there was one team who took a 18U AAA kid, in the 6th or 7th round. I wonder if we're going to see, if teams are trying to like, okay, these other players are so well scouted from those leagues, and finding quote unquote late finds now is going to be even less because everyone is so good at scouting. I go back to, I don't know if I've told the story on this podcast or not, but either way, it's interesting. I remember being up in Traverse City one year. It was Ken Holland's second to last year, third to last year with the Wings, and he was up in Traverse City, and he was talking to myself and Scott Powers about kind of how much drafting had changed from when he was when the Red Wings were building their dynasty. He compared it to ice fishing, where you go to the hole and you pull out a Datsuk, and you pull out a Zetterberg, and you pull out and all of a sudden you start pulling these fish out of the hole, and the other fishermen be like, "Oh, I'm going to go look in your hole," and now there's 32 fishing rods in the hole, and it's less likely to get the big fish. So I wonder if we're now seeing a little bit of in the late rounds, teams kind of prying, maybe like, oh, maybe I have to go completely off the board because the WHL, the OHL, the USHL, they're so drafted, they're scouted so well. There's not really any unknowns, I think, left in those leagues.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. I'm of the mindset that the scouting has gotten much better in certain leagues. And, I think really the scouting's gotten pretty good in the CHL. For the most part, you're not pulling a lot of studs in late rounds out of the OHL, WHL, or QMJHL. And then recently we've seen a lot more advances in Swedish scouting, where now you're not pulling as many studs out of, the Swedish juniors, or Liga or Mestis or, any of the junior Finnish leagues. And now we're starting to see a shift where you're starting to get scouting into the DEL in Germany, and even for the Red Wings, taking Kevin Bicker in the 5th round. He played primarily in the DNL, which is German juniors. And now we're going to see some top players coming out of Switzerland, Slovakia, Czechia. And so I think there are still some leagues that haven't necessarily quite caught up to all the other leagues. But the point that I think you make about the players that slide is a fascinating one. And this is something, I can't remember who said this to me. I think it was somebody in the NHL. I cannot remember exactly who, but it takes 32 teams to pass on a guy, but only one to reach for them. So if somebody slides, 32 different, picks were made instead of that player. Whereas if somebody is picked high, it just took that one team to really like them. And so you kind of learn a little bit more about the guys who slide. And it's, it'd be fascinating to go back and look at it. The guys who were considered quote unquote sliders late in the draft, how many of them really panned out? Were all teams wrong to let them slide? And how much has that really changed since, the Ken Holland analogy you just said? You're not pulling Pavel Datsuk out of the 6th round anymore. Like, that's not happening because we're not letting those guys slide all the way down into the 4th, 5th, and 6th. I think it's still happening with goalies, which we've talked about. We talked about Dustin Wolf and, some of these other guys that have been taken in later rounds. But, at least for forwards, we haven't really been seeing it all that much.
Yeah, it's the German league too. I think it's an interesting point that obviously for Red Wings fans, obviously, I think there's a strong connection here, obviously with Mo Seider and everything like that. And I think the strength of German hockey is on the rise too. Like you look at, and it's, I know Seider has talked quite a bit about how much Leon Draisaitl has really led that charge. And at Red Wings development camp, I asked Chris Draper about because obviously they took a German, as you said, this year, about scouting the DEL and the DNL and everything like that. And he also talked a lot about how Seider has really pushed that. And I'm really interested to see, as I wrote something about kind of German hockey during the season. One thing I'd like to maybe do, once we're back in the season and I have access to more German players again, I'd be interested to kind of follow up on that story now. Now that we have the base, we have the first charge, right? If you want to say, like, of the superstar. Not that there hasn't been Germans before. I mean, Olaf Kolzig was, if you talk about pulling goalie knowledge, right? Olaf Kolzig. But you go from Draisaitl wins the MVP as a German in the NHL. And if we were to use that as a flashpoint for German hockey, I wonder if you use that as the before and after point, if that is the space where you can use that to build, like, okay, German hockey from before and after Draisaitl wins the Hart. I'd be curious to look at that sometime during this season. Look at it sometime again 5 years from now. I'd really be interested to see where that goes. And then there's things like, maybe if Wings fans would love this, if Seider becomes a Norris Trophy winner, if he evolves into a Norris Trophy, you use points like that. I'm really interested to see how that raises player participation, growth of the game, but then also raises the risks. Like, right now, there's no risk in taking a Canadian. There's no risk in taking an American. Right now, if you're a team and you're a front office, you're like, okay, I can take a Canadian, I can take an American. They pan out into hockey players. I wonder if we have, as front offices slowly start to get rid of the risk in their mind of, I'm taking a guy from the German league. I don't know. There's risk there. I wonder if, especially Seider has talked glowingly about playing as a pro, as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old in Germany and how much it helped him. I wonder how much those conversations are helping kind of turn the tide where GMs are no longer thinking, I'm taking a risk if I'm taking a guy from a developing hockey country.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, because it really just does take one or two successful players from a country to kind of have that globalization happen in a league like the DEL, the DNL. You can throw this all the way back 40, 50 years ago and talk about this with Sweden, with Borje Salming, being one of the first Swedish defensemen to kind of make a mainstay, Håkan Loob, Kent Nilsson. You throw it back to some of the first Swedish players in the NHL, and they really paved the way for the wave of your, Nick Lidströms, your Peter Forsbergs. Like, those guys came after growing up watching the guys that were there before them. And you're going to see the same concept now over in Germany. You're going to see it in Slovakia with, all of the great Slovakian players that we've had recently. We've seen it more and more in Czechia. We're going to see it in Switzerland now, especially with Austin Matthews spending some time playing over there prior to the draft as well. Like, that's a league that's gained a lot more attention, the NLA and the NLB. And so there's basically a lot of globalization happening. So to get back to where we all started on this, I think there are some leagues where the scouting has gotten very good. You're less likely to pull gems out of that league in later rounds because it is so scouted. But I still think there are some European leagues out there that have not been scouted as well as the CHL, as well as the U.S. National Development Program. And you're more likely to maybe find a gem. Granted, it's not the highest of likelihoods, but you are more likely to potentially find a gem there. I go back to a guy like Jesper Bratt, 2016. I think he was a sixth round pick, if I remember correctly. He's a guy where, you're potentially pulling him from a lower league that hadn't been scouted as well. Carolina's done this a lot with Finland, although I think the Finnish scouting has started to get a lot better. And so we'll just see where the next wave really comes. But potentially one area where teams could optimize their drafting is we talked about goalies maybe only going after fifth round. What if you just don't draft from North America after the fifth round? What if you focus your picks on what leagues you consider under-scouted, where you have a player that you really like, and potentially that's a player that becomes a gem because less eyes saw them? That's potentially another optimization strategy, and one that I think Carolina has kind of done a lot in terms of drafting late out of Russia, for teams that are kind of reticent to draft from there, taking Alex Pashin, taking Nikishin, taking Trikazov. I mean, there's so many guys that have they've kind of waited a little bit longer in there. So, hey, maybe that's another way to approach the draft.
The Russian thing is interesting too, because there's obviously a space where the natural curve of everything Russia right now is under-scouted. There is, like, the Flyers were one of the things about the Michkov story that comes out is the Flyers were one of the teams that kept their scouts in Russia. There's some, I believe Carolina did too. There are some other teams that did not keep their scouts in Russia. After the invasion of the Ukraine, there's some teams that pulled their scouts out, and essentially all their Russian scouting was done via video. And I think that's another interesting. We'll have another interesting kind of space for cross-section for however long this geopolitical crisis goes on, and call what it is, an invasion. As long as the invasion goes on, it will be interesting, that cross-section of how certain teams, some teams will be more aggressive in taking bets on players from Russia. Other teams will be more risk-averse. It's going to be interesting to see how teams kind of how to tackle all of that. But it's like, I think it's the Michkov thing, him going at 7 probably is a big part of that. The Flyers having a scout actually keeping their scouts in Russia was interesting to me. And, the other thing, just to kind of, if you try to put a nice bow on the draft with all of this, with between the quote unquote Russian factor and where teams are, I'm interested to see, and you and I have talked a lot about on this show about how, and we've been asked by listeners about, okay, where are we in the analytical push for drafting, right? Like, where are we on using, where are we on using advanced metrics for drafting from this league versus that league? At some point, I think we're going to hit a more normalized, we're not there yet, right? Like, we've talked about that. We're going to hit a more normalized about that. And then there'll be another change. And then there'll be another kind of, I think it'll be interesting to see. I'm really interested to see, what type of, player, like, for lack of a better word, if we can quantify some of these player archetypes that come from different countries. Like, I remember when I was at the coaches clinic, the coach of the Czech women's national team talked about how the Czechs were at the best from an early age. They learn how to protect the puck better than anyone else in the world. And Pete DeBoer talked about Thomas Hertel was one of the best puck protection players. Like, it would be very interesting to see, like, we have these stereotypes, and as we get this data and as we move further in this, I'd like to see, are they actually stereotypes or are they archetypes? Like, what is which one it will be? And as you, like, if you're really drafting a Czech guy, is it normally, are you buying too much into stereotypes, or is it really, you really are probably drafting a pretty good puck protector? I don't know. Like, those are kind of the next steps of things as we move forward in this space to try to wrap us up on the draft and get us onto some sort of process, I guess.
Yeah, so basically, to summarize, everybody's a winner, everybody's a loser, because we're really only judging teams against public lists that are available, and teams have wildly different lists that they maintain. Ultimately, the teams that are going to do the best are the ones that maximize their ability to take as many shots as possible in the draft, to get as many different players, and potentially teams that maybe focus a little bit of their later rounds on under-scouted leagues in Europe, maybe ones that come away with a couple more late-round gems to kind of put that nice bow on it. And so, before we shift into the free agency spot, I just want to put a plug that if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wingwheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Wingwheel Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wingwheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which does have an Expected by Whom dedicated channel that you can bug Sean and I in, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're part of the Wingwheel Podcast Content Network. And so let's shift gears a little bit, talk about NHL free agency. We've had a couple of weeks to see stuff play out. Sean, you got any early impressions on kind of winners and losers here, which we can better judge?
Yeah, I mean, free agency, I have a much better feel on what these guys are, and we all have I've seen these guys play. That's the for my first thought just on NHL free agency is, how is Corey Perry in the year 2023 of our Lord getting $4 million on as an NHL free agent? Like that's the first, like, I still keep coming back to that, where and that's just kind of a reflection. It's a 1-year deal. It's a reflection of, it was a weird year for free agency, right? Like that's the burst. The first thing is the big trend, right? A lot of shorter deals, a lot of players. We heard about the soft free agency market. We had a lot of players who were surprisingly available because of the cap crunch, whether it's because they had arb rights where they were not qualified, or their qualifying offer would have been too high, and so they all of a sudden became free agents. And we had some buyouts too, and so the market changed, like got very fluid. And for me, the fact that we saw so many 1-year deals and so many players, kind of, whether it was by design or it just happened where it happened just kind of because that's what everything dictated, basically be either betting on themselves or being forced to bet on themselves on these 1-year deals and hoping to capitalize when the cap does, in theory, go up next summer and the summer after. This is not because of, and it's not because I covered them. It's just, I legitimately think what they did with Duchesne is a really nice piece of work. Like, I think Dallas jumping on Duchesne being available as a UFA who was not supposed to be there. I thought it was a really nice piece of work by Dallas. I don't really, like, you look around, and I've got like the list here, right? So I can kind of keep track of things. Like, I like what, like, for what they're trying to do, right? Like, Arizona kind of at least did what they're trying to kind of do. Like, it's a sliding scale, right? Like, yeah, they're getting close to the cap. They're above the cap floor. They still have like 17 million in cap space or whatever. And then I thought I liked the Toffoli edition for New Jersey. Just looking around, like, just obviously I'm just going over UFA stuff, and then on the flip side, I get you have to spend money somewhere, but I don't understand some of the spending the Ducks did. Like, I don't understand the overpay. I mean, you got to pay someone to play, but I don't really get that too. So those are just some initial UFA stuff, obviously the RFA stuff, and we can talk more about the Wings and DeBrincat, because I think that's a big win of the offseason to get DeBrincat signed for the term, for the cost, and we can talk more about that one in a vacuum in a second. But from the UFA spot, those are just some of my scatter shooting thoughts as we kind of come out of there.
Yeah, I think starting with where you started in terms of Dallas, that Matt Duchene deal was tremendous. Now, I didn't necessarily love everything else that they did in the offseason in terms of bringing in, Sam Steele they brought in, and it was fine additions, and Craig Smith as well. I mean, they're fine, but I just don't know that that's truly, like, I guess, what's the right word I'm looking for here? Like, that's what's going to put them over the top in the West. But really, the Matt Duchene deal is the cream of the crop. I mean, 1 year, $3 million. Every team should have been lining up to do that. I think, Chicago, what Chicago's doing is really interesting. They added a lot. Being able to bring in Taylor Hall, Nick Foligno, Corey Perry. Obviously, they spent a lot of money on Corey Perry, but putting veteran players that have had success in the NHL around Connor Bedard, I think is going to be a tremendous benefit to him. And more than anything on the ice, it protects him off the ice, in the sense of he is not going to be the one answering or having to answer these questions and stand up in front of the media when the team is struggling. This kid's 18 years old. That puts a lot of undue pressure on him. So I really like what Chicago did in terms of bringing in kind of quality veteran players that can help them. But I think if I'm picking an ultimate winner, it's got to be what New Jersey did. I mean, being able to lock up Jesper Bratt, being able to lock up, Timo Meyer, get both those guys signed when a lot of people thought they were going to have to get rid of one, and then get Tyler Toffoli to add to that top six. I mean, that's arguably the best top six in the NHL, bar none. I have a hard time coming up with a better top six than what they have in terms of Nico Hischier and Jack Hughes down the middle, and then having, your wings be Meyer, Bratt, and Toffoli. Like, I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous. So they're very loaded. And then, I'll put a small plug in for my local team down here in Carolina. They're already a very good hockey team, but then being able to add Michael Bunting and Dmitry Orlov, and who knows, maybe they find a way to still get Vladimir Tarasenko. And now you're talking about Tarasenko basically playing like third or fourth line minutes on the Carolina Hurricanes. That's a ridiculous amount of depth there. So those are some teams that I thought did really well in the early part of free agency.
Let's take a quick sidewinder too on Carolina, because I think there's something that I heard about the other day that I wanted to bring up. So Carolina, obviously, we know and we see Peter Kochetkov is the future in net there, right? But they still re-signed both Freddie Anderson and Antti Raanta this year, and it was something that was mildly surprising to me, because obviously you hear about Kochetkov being the guy, and now all of a sudden you're going to bring back two veteran goalies. I've heard that Carolina this year may carry three goalies because they don't have the AHL affiliate. It's something where, because, and now for the quick 30-second elevator, Chicago Wolves, Carolina Hurricanes basically split apart this year. The Hurricanes were the Wolves decided they wanted to go independent, even though the two they won a Calder Cup 2 years ago. Last year the Wolves missed the playoffs, and the Wolves are run differently than most AHL teams. They are run as a team where they want to be independent. Winning championships is more important to the Chicago Wolves than development at the end of the day. They would argue with me and say you develop by winning, but at the end of the day, it's about winning, and they felt that they weren't getting that with Carolina, even though they won a title the year prior. But so this year, the Hurricanes don't have a AHL affiliate, so they will be kind of piecemealing where they send prospects. They'll be sending different guys around. They could have done something with, and so I heard, obviously, how and where Kochetkov plays this year is going to be fascinating, but I've heard, because of just that reality, that's one of the reasons they did this, where it's like they may need to go three goalies because they don't really have a place to house a true number three, or it's an interesting just space there. So just quick sidewinder insight thing I heard in the last couple of days when you brought up Carolina.
Yeah, when you bring that up, it kind of goes back to some of the previous conversations we've had on the show about how teams utilize their goalies. And are we potentially seeing a new wave where, we've seen for years, it's been this one dominant starter, you have your backup that can play your 20 to 25 games. Are we now even shifting even further from just a 1A, 1B model to where you really have to have a 1A, 1B, 1C model? And in that case, does it behoove a team like Carolina to have those three goalies kind of available to really keep the workload down? I mean, we're talking about Freddie Anderson, a guy who's had a lot of different injury issues, groin issues, knee issues. You don't want him playing 50 games. in the regular season, where you really want them to be healthy and ready to go in the playoffs. Antti Ranta is 32, 33. Another guy who's, played a lot of hockey. You probably don't want him going 40 games. So if you have a potentially, and I have no insight if this is actually Carolina's plan, but obviously not having the affiliate, if you're carrying the 3 goalies, are you able to almost rotate like a 30-30-20 type benefit, keep all your goalies fresh? And, when you hit the playoffs, you've kind of got 3 guys that haven't played a ton of hockey in the year, but are kind of ready to go. And we saw from Vegas this past year, sometimes you need your 4th goalie to be the one to carry you to the Stanley Cup. And so is it a new strategy that we're going to see more teams employ, given the volatility of goalies, just from an injury standpoint, from a performance standpoint? Because it wasn't just Carolina this year. I mean, we saw it with Alex Lyon in Florida. He was the 3rd guy there, but with Spencer Knight in the players' assistance program and Bobrovsky not on his game, Lyon takes over. Toronto has to turn to Joseph Woll, after Matt Murray goes down and Samsonov goes down. So, it's not a bad strategy. It might actually be a sign of something new that we're going to see.
I think the other thing it opens up, it's an idea that, and I got to give, I doubt Teddy will be listening to the show, but a guy who was he was a baseball guy who, when I covered the Texas Stars, he was an intern who went to the University of Texas. And Teddy, his name's Teddy Berlin, Teddy would always ask me why hockey teams don't do what baseball teams do, where when they're playing back-to-back, why don't they, like baseball teams, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if they all do this, but I believe they fly the starting pitcher in the day before. Like if they're traveling, like the starting pitcher is flying the day before to get there so they get a full night's rest. If you have 3 goalies, if you're Carolina, right, and you have a back-to-back, say you got a back-to-back where you're going Carolina, Boston. You have home game in Boston. All right, we're going to start Kochetkov tonight. Ronta will back up. Anderson's going to start tomorrow night in Boston. We put Freddie Anderson on a flight to Boston. Now, he gets a good night's sleep. He's not on a team plane till 1 a.m. He wakes up refreshed. We just meet him in Boston. Like I think of like these little like intricacies of this system that could work, because you still have, in case a goalie pulls a groin or gets lit up on the first 3 shots he faces, you have an NHL option right there that you trust, but your other guy is resting and getting ready for his start the next night. Like, I wonder if that's a system where you think outside the box as a team and start to look at that with back-to-backs in the league and things like that. The other thing with Kochetkov that will be really interesting, because I believe he's still waiver exempt. I'd have to double check that. I believe he is still waiver exempt. We should check that before I make a grand kind of a grand, let's pull up the waiver calculator on Cap Friendly.
He is still waiver exempt Cap Friendly.
Okay, so this is where Kochetkov becomes really interesting to me. And this is a very AHL nerdy thing. Pyotr Kochetkov is now the most valuable piece for the AHL movement deadline. The AHL movement deadline is a week after the NHL trade deadline. If you're Don Waddell, and now if Kochetkov's your guy and he's your starter, like in Carolina, great, then keep him there. But if you're going to if you're doing this 3 goalie system throughout the season, you get to the AHL movement deadline, all of a sudden you're Don Waddell and you're looking around and you're like, you can just start reaching out to every team in the league that's a contender and be like, hey, you want a guy that want to call their cup? We want a guy to start every game the rest of the way. We can assign him to you. I think all of a sudden Pyotr Kochetkov now becomes the big mover in the AHL movement deadline, not trade deadline, movement deadline, with this potential system. We are going really far on this, and I love it, but I'm going to let you get me back on track here.
I mean, look, I could talk about this for hours, and maybe what we should do at some point is just devote an episode to bringing on a goalie expert and talking about this, but I'm going to throw out my theory on this before we kind of rein it back in and get back to free agency here. I think the advent and kind of the adoption of the butterfly style brought in by Patrick Waugh and really kind of adopted late 90s has put a heavy strain on goalies starting at a young age, because you're taught the butterfly from the get-go. And the butterfly is very taxing on the body compared to the traditional stand-up style. You're constantly dropping to the knees. It puts a lot of pressure on your joints, puts a lot of strain on your ligaments, your tendons. And does that potentially impact durability of these goalies as they go on, to where these are goalies that are not necessarily able to withstand that same workload that prior goalies, that played this hybrid style or played, a mixed version of the style, or even people who adopted the butterfly once they were in the NHL. They don't necessarily have the 20 years of training that's put that strain on their joints and ligaments. That's my theory. And what I really think it needs to happen is exactly what Carolina's doing, what Vegas did, what Florida did, what Toronto did. Is it's not about one goalie anymore. It's not even about two goalies anymore. It's really, you've got to have a stable of 3 or 4 goalies that are capable of giving you at least NHL average goaltending, because the days of you being able to rely on one goaltender staying healthy, being able to play at that same level, they're just not there anymore. They're very isolated. I mean, you have your Connor Hellebuck, sure. You have your, we had Henrik Lundqvist, but we don't really have that guy that you can count even night in and night out. Even a guy like Vasilevsky starting to break down in the playoffs we saw. So I'm just interested in seeing how teams go about this, and if there is going to be something to quote unquote load management of goalies in the NHL.
It's the butterfly, and it's then about in the last 8 years or so, it's the RVH. That's the other one, where it's the integration, the post integration, where you already had the pounding on the knees and everything like that, and in the hips and everything from the butterfly style. But then with how goalie post play is now, they're now slamming so hard into posts every game, every practice. It's all those micro collisions against the post that were never part of it before. I mean, as someone who, I put this on Twitter, like I play Max Boltman and I play beer league, right? And, I don't do an RVH. I'm 34 years old but we played a team last night of 18 and 19 year olds that literally had 2 goalies in a beer league game. Like, they had 2 goalies in a beer league game. They both took warm-ups. They switched, and these kids are doing RVHs and everything like that, doing these things that just make my hips hurt doing it. But the amount of slamming into the posts, the amount of physical contact, the amount of things that now goes into that kids are taught. And they have to do it because players are so good at finding the smallest holes. So you have to do it. That really added even further to the shortening careers. Like, I mean, to hurt the longevity of careers. I mean, I'm amazed that, like, and maybe, who knows, maybe signed by soon, but like, I'm amazed that someone has not signed a Yara Halak for a number 3 role like this yet. Just to be like, hey, you know what? We need a guy who can play 15 to 20 games, but playing those 15 to 20 games are going to save our 1A and 1B. You're going to be our 1C. You're going to still get 10 to 15 starts. And you're like, I'm surprised he hasn't been signed yet, because I think that's, and maybe teams are kind of jockeying for that. I think like Alex Stalock is still available. Maybe that's kind of the next wave of free agency, which we can use to get back to free agency.
Yeah, and so getting back to free agency, we can even use the goalies to segue back in, because I saw a lot of people asking questions about, why did Detroit sign 2 goalies? Why did they go out and sign James Reimer and Alex Lyon? Well, it's for this exact reason, most likely, is you need 3 competent NHL goalies to be able to offset the workload from Ville Husso. Now, that's not to say the Wings will carry all 3 goalies. I don't expect them to do that, given the skaters that they want to be able to get rotated in. But there's certainly an opportunity to get the most out of both those guys backing up Ville Husso. So that was kind of another interesting move made by Yzerman to kind of add some depth there. But, we've talked about our winners from unrestricted free agency. So let's shift into kind of the last part of the episode, saving the best for last. Let's talk about the trades that happened. We had a lot of big trades happen. We had Pierre-Luc Dubois go over to Los Angeles. And then for Detroit fans, obviously Alex DeBrincat coming home. That's a big one. Which of those 2 deals do you think is going to be more impactful for those teams based on kind of what was given up?
We're talking about DeBrincat versus Dubois. We're talking about.
Yep.
Okay. I think the DeBrincat deal is more impactful because I think I don't know about in year one. I think in year one, LA will still be a better team, but I think over the life of the deal, I think Detroit gave up much less, obviously, than LA gave for Dubois. And, I think with, just kind of the nature of, we talked so much about the players, so many players trying to capitalize on this short market of 1 year deal, 2 year deal, trying to buy themselves into that big UFA Scrooge McDuck pile of money 2 years from now. The Red Wings basically bought the rest of Alex DeBrincat's prime and avoided long-term deal and avoided all of that. I mean, the sign part of the sign and trade, to me is a big piece here because I think Detroit got better for the long term. If this makes sense, I think Detroit got better for the long term with the deal. I think LA, I worry about the aging of that Dubois deal past 2-3 years, and I think they gave a pretty hefty amount for it, especially in a spot where everyone knew that, like, at some point Dubois was going to have to move anyway. Like Ottawa sold, in my view, Ottawa sold too early. Ottawa should have sat on it, in my view. And and I think LA bought too early. I think that's how I would look at it in this space.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I don't know that I agree with LA bought too early. I think they bought the wrong player. I don't think Pierre-Luc Dubois is as good as people, maybe talk about him to be. He obviously got put under the microscope when in the COVID tournament he had that tremendous playoff series with Columbus against Toronto, against Tampa. I haven't seen much from him since then. I haven't really seen anything that makes me think this guy's a number one pivot, a number two pivot. Like, he's a good hockey player, but is he better than Alex DeBrincat? I don't think so. Yes, they're playing two different positions, but I would rather have DeBrincat than have Dubois. And so I think LA bought at the right time. They've got a lot of really good young pieces. They've got a lot in the prospect pool. They're kind of transitioning from the Andrei Kopitar phase, although they have him for 2 more years, into kind of this new role or this new phase that'll be led by the younger generation. And so I see why they wanted to add another young player to that core that can kind of grow there. But I don't think Dubois was the right guy to add. Now, DeBrincat for Detroit, I think he's a tremendous addition. But the most important thing I have to say is he can't be the only addition. This team is still quite far from being comfortably in the playoff conversation. If you compare, now hindsight is 2020. If you compare what the Red Wings opening night lineup looked like last season with Bertuzzi, with Vrana, with Larkin, with all of those guys in there. Now, obviously, we know what happened with Bertuzzi. We know what happened with Vrana. But about the playoff odds are honestly being projected to be about the same for where that team was last year and where the team was this year, which is about 30%. If you go and you look at the odds makers from last season, they gave the Wings, a 29.4% playoff probability. Playoff probability aren't out yet this year, but based on the Stanley Cup probabilities being about the same, I suspect they're going to open in the same format. So, it's a good addition for the Wings to bring in DeBrincat, but you probably need one other elite player to bring in, and probably the biggest area to upgrade is going to be on defense. And so I really like what it signals for Detroit. I like the guy in terms of what he adds to the team, but I also think the Wings have to be careful not to think he is going to be the answer, because there's still a lot more needed here.
Yeah, there was a pretty good line. I was reading, let me see if I can find the exact line from it for, so Sam Stockton, who is now joined the Wings media universe, now doing the stuff for the Hockey News. He had a pretty good line, and I was reading his breakdown of DeBrincat today. And where is it? we need like a producer. We need Ryan to come in here live and like look stuff up for me while we're doing
exactly
the let's see, where is it? Okay. This was his line, and I really liked this. I thought he summed up really well. He said, DeBrincat is a decisive player more than an influential one. And I thought that was a really good way to put it, where DeBrincat is a player that he can decide, he can have those deciding moments. He can score goals. You'll see him at those points, but he's not someone who I'm all of a sudden being like, okay, I'm now planning saving playoff dates at Little Caesars Arena because they brought him in. I think that's a really good way to look at it. And as you said, there needs to be something else here. There needs to be something else done. And whether that's done now in season, whether that's done, there's something else to do in the free agency, I don't know. I mean, you could still pick around and see what's there, but it's kind of this was the best you could really, with this DeBrincat situation, you did great. In a vacuum, it's great. And now it's the cruel nature of sports. What can you do for me next? That's really what it is right now.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that it is that way, but I think the other thing that I'll add to what you just said there is in terms of when the Wings are going to do something, what the Wings will have to keep in mind is with their young crop of guys coming up, your Marco Kasper, your Simon Edvinsson, your Nate Danielson, your Alex Sandin Pellikka, with that crop of guys coming up, those guys have to come in and be able to very quickly offset any potential decline you see from the guys from the veteran players you've signed, which is your Justin Holes, your Ben Sherratts, your Oli Matas. All those guys are on the books for at least 2 more years. Being able to offset any potential decline from Andrew Kopp if he doesn't find his form back from the core surgery, any potential decline from JT Compher. And so that's where I'm most interested to see this Red Wings team is as those guys come up in the next 1 to 2 years, will they be able to have an impact early enough in their careers that maximizes your ability to win on the DeBrincat 4-year contract? Because they only went 4 years. They didn't go longer, which 4 is fine. It takes you to DeBrincat being 30, but I think it also sort of signals that the Wings have an out if they can't find a way to win and get back, in that good graces and find the other players to add around them. There's almost like a built-in out spot for them to kind of tear back down. So what I would expect to see is if the Wings are truly committed to winning in the next, in this DeBrincat contract, there's going to have to be a handful more additions via trade or unrestricted free agency, because as this team continues to get better, your draft picks are only getting worse in terms of their position, and you're less likely to get an impactful player that can join the roster within 3 years.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that's a really good way to look at it. You look at the DeBrincat, and both were kind of like coy when asked about it. Both Yzerman and DeBrincat were asked like, "Oh, what did he sell you? What the vision he sold you on, and everything like that." And we actually got more. I mean, to be honest, we got more clarity from Yzerman this week than I thought we would ever get. The fact that he was so open about the Zadina situation right off the bat, like that was something to me where that was surprisingly clear. So I guess, but when you're asking about like, oh, what was the vision he sold DeBrincat on? And like, based off the contract, the clear vision DeBrincat was sold on is that this team is contending in year 3 and 4. That is how I read this, where it's year 1 and 2 are about getting to year 3 and 4 to contend. To me, that's the crux of this. And you know what? If it doesn't work by year 3 and 4, Alex can go sign somewhere else and be part of some other and go to his Taylor Hall stage of his career where he bounces around to like every other team for like 4 or 5 seasons. It's all about for Detroit right now. If you can, this year is, to me, it still feels so much like a bit of this, and it hurts that you haven't been in the playoffs this long, but it still feels like the gravy stage, right? Like if you get into the playoffs this year, I think that's still gravy. I think the bigger point of it is you need to be in 2 seasons from now And then you need to have a place where you're like, you know what, we can get in and we can win some rounds 3 years from now. I think if you keep those goals in mind, and I think that's what the Iser plan, if I'm trying to figure out what it is, might be right now. And I think that's where Derek Lalonde his head is at as he's trying to build a team towards that. I think that's kind of the thought process, because a lot of the other guys who are signed, while they're interesting and they might be part of something like Shane Gostisbehere, you need someone to help the power play this year. You need people to help things along the way. You need bringing in James Reimer and Alex Lyon. Like, I actually like Alex. I like the Lyon signing, but you need someone else to back up Ville Husso this year. Obviously, the goal is 3 years from now. It's Ville Husso 1A, Sebastian Cossa 1B. That's the goal 3 years from now. Like, it's about getting to 3 years from now where you're actually contending, and you want to make it as enjoyable as possible along the way, but it's not vital, if that makes sense.
Completely agree. So really, folks, if we can summarize the Iser plan as succinctly as possible, I think it's this team has to be a comfortable playoff contender. They should comfortably be projected to be in the playoffs by 2025, 2026. That's what we're talking about. This is a team that, when no one bats an eye when you say they'll probably be in the playoffs. And that's how you'll know that this has worked, because that's what you're building to now by adding DeBrincat. You've given yourself kind of a narrow window to continue to add in free agency while also developing the guys you've already got drafted, while also balancing any potential drop off from the veterans you've signed. You are really giving yourself about a 3-year window to make this happen, and a really short window to kind of contend in. That being said, there's a lot that can still change. A lot can still happen. The 2024 unrestricted free agency crop is a tremendous crop if, a handful of guys do end up getting there. And so there is a potential for the Wings to really make a big splash. But I think as best as we can see it, that's where the Iser plan is heading. It is building to 2025, 2026 being a no doubt playoff contender.
I agree with that. I think that's the best way I could put it. So,
all right. Well, folks, we've
I have one thing. I have one thing. I have one thing I want to end today on. With this being expected by whom, I want to bring up I got an email during the show from one of those like sports betting sites that sends out that floods email inboxes with people and everything like that. And I just want to label something as a poor use of data, because we talk about where the eye test matches the data and vice versa. And if it doesn't, your data set is completely wrong. So I got an email from this website where they're using, I won't even say their name because I'm not going to promote a sports betting partner. I'm just going to make fun of how their data ideology, where they ranked the NHL's least aggressive teams. Okay. And the data point they used was hits and fights. And they crowned the least aggressive team in the NHL as the Carolina Hurricanes. So if your data is crowning the Carolina Hurricanes as the least aggressive team in the NHL, when frankly it's the opposite, and all we ever hear about is it's true, we watch it, we see it, the Carolina forecheck is the most aggressive in the league, you need to throw out your data set completely. So this was just, this email literally popped up while we were recording. I texted you to make sure I got into this, because this is a bad use of data where you should sometimes double check and look at your numbers and say, you know what, maybe that's not right. So
just because the data is there does not mean you need to use it. Let's just leave it at that. Because if you're looking at the Carolina Hurricanes and telling me that they're not an aggressive team, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're watching. Because that is the most relentless, aggressive forecheck in all of hockey. Teams hate playing them for a reason. We are the most relentless podcast when it comes to debunking analytics, qualms, while also giving enough credence to what people can see and actually help measure and help find better things to measure. And so that's what we're trying to do here on Expected by Whom. Find a different way to measure aggressiveness other than hits and fights, so that you get to more robust conclusions. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about our podcast, please direct those directly to Ryan Hanna, where you can find him on Threads now, in addition to Twitter, although you can't DM him in there. So just feel free to spam his timeline. And folks, that'll do it for us today for another episode of Expected by Whom. We'll catch you next week. We should be back on schedule from here on out. So stay tuned, folks.